This is the next installment of our Wednesday evening Bible study that we are studying some of what I believe are the 10 most important stories in the Old and New Testament in the Bible. And we earlier had in earlier sessions had some discussion about whether this event or this story should be lifted higher on the list or put lower on the list, or maybe we should include this or include that. But for the sake of just moving on, we're going to go with the list, that I came up with. And since we missed last week, we're going to put two together for this week, and that is the number 3 on the list. Number 1 was the resurrection of Jesus. Number 2 is the crucifixion of Jesus. And of course, as we talked about, those can't really be separated from each other. They only draw meaning when they are connected to each other. So we actually serendipitously smashed those two together in one session as well. Today we're going to be talking about the incarnation, and I'm going to skip a couple on my list and go to the Lord's Supper and to speak about the connection between incarnation and the Lord's Supper. So, any questions before we get started?
Nope.
Okay. Incarnation, as you probably know, means simply infleshed. Carne is meat, it's flesh. And it is, we say that in Jesus, God chose to become incarnate and become a human being. For some of this context, it would be fun and even helpful to go back to the creation story. But we when we're talking about incarnation specifically, we're talking about the incarnation of Jesus, the God of the Hebrews, the God of the Jews. By the first century, they were called the Jews. The God of Abraham and Sarah, and for 2,000 years, their descendants. That God, whom they believed and we believe, was the creator of the whole universe. That God chooses to enter creation. Again, the context is the understanding that God created, and the first chapter of Genesis essentially ends with God looked at everything that God had created, and behold, it was very good. Then we have another version or another take on creation that's not the same as Genesis 1. It's a different story, but both stories together set up for Genesis 3. Genesis 3 is the famous Adam and Eve in the garden taking the fruit, the forbidden fruit, and and that chapter and that story is the basis of an understanding that while God created the world in a state of shalom or stasis, where things were at peace. It was human decisions that disrupted that paradise. And we're not to understand and blame that darn Adam and that darn Eve for making that one bad choice, and all the rest of us got tainted with their sin. There's kind of a strain of that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but much more powerful is the understanding that Adam and Eve are figures representing every single one of us, and that we continually make decisions to misuse the gifts of creation that God has so generously laid out before us, and that 10, 20, I lose count how many times a day I figuratively reach for that forbidden fruit, and I say, it really looks good. I bet it tastes good. I'm going to go for it. And it's those choices that ultimately alienate us from the Creator, or not alienate is too strong. It creates a barrier between us and a righteous God. Does that make sense?
Yep.
We have something in the background. What?
I don't know. There's someone else talking.
Somebody's on the phone.
I wonder why we're getting that.
Could that be my TV in the other room?
Certainly.
I think it might be possible. It's interesting.
Okay, let me do something about it.
Picking it up, but I'll wait until she's back. I'm not hearing anything now. Oh, now I am.
It's right into it. Is that better?
Yes, it seems to be better.
Oh my gosh.
I think
Sorry
so.
about that.
I think we're good. We may have had interference, but that I don't hear it anymore. So
No, I don't either.
So any questions about that, about the understanding of the goodness of creation, our participation in the ongoing desecration of the good creation, and then God's plan to heal that, overcome that divide, heal that that division that we have created between ourselves and God by our ongoing choices to sin, to be sinners. Any questions up to this point?
Well, very clear.
Thank you. So the incarnation for us Christians is the understanding that God, the creator of the universe, God who made a particular set of promises to Abraham and Sarah and their descendants, the Jewish people, that God chose ultimately to overcome the divide between him and us by becoming one of us. by becoming, even though he's creator, he becomes part of creation. It's pretty much beyond reason. I mean, we might have the language for it, but every time I try to think about it and try to associate the one that I think is the power, I'll say the power behind the Big Bang. I believe what scientists tell us about the kind of how the world came into being, except that they're never able to say who started that.
Right.
Who lit the match for the Big Bang?
Right.
And I believe I know. And I find no kind of contradiction between science, what I believe scientifically, and what I believe theologically. They are both, in my opinion, true. One is a set of facts, and the other is an understanding of the universe and my place in it, and that comes from my religion. Let me stop there again. Any comments, questions?
Been very good.
Confusion?
I like what you said. Yes.
Okay. So to hear we hear over and over and over again at around Christmas time, for obvious reasons, the stories from Matthew and from Luke about the kind of the origin stories of Jesus, and those are important for us because they have come into our tradition as a set of stories that's full of meaning. It's more than just sentimental scenes. It's a narrative. It's a very dramatic. Why we have so many Christmas dramas. It's a very dramatic presentation of the inconceivable understanding that the God who created the universe, the God who started the Big Bang, it is now lying in diapers in a manger. If your head hasn't exploded already, this is about the time to maybe put on a football helmet and try to contain it. It's just that's the unreasonable assertion that we Christians make about the ministry of Jesus, the authority of Jesus, why he's more than just a great teacher or an example. We Christians say he is God. So as I said, Matthew and Luke both give us Christmas stories that are again dramatic, but they're not theological interpretations.
But they also give us some historical perspective, because historians know when the Caesar Augustus census was.
Right.
So it gives us some time frame of when Jesus was born.
That's a really good point. And it's important to both of those authors to timestamp their story.
Yeah.
And to say this is not a once upon a time tale that I'm going to give you. This is in the reign of Julius Caesar, not Julius Caesar Augustus. When this guy was in this position and this guy was in this position, that's when this happened. And it's an assertion of the reality of what he's going to present. I have to grab my glasses 1 second. So what we're going to get a little more theological sense of the what we mean by the incarnation. We're going to look at the beginning of John's gospel. John, remember, is the last gospel to have been written. It was written maybe as much as 70 years, that's 2 generations after the resurrection of Jesus. It bears the name of the disciple John. It's highly unlikely that the disciple John wrote this, but John, it's more likely that somebody who was a student of John's wrote, kind of taking notes from his mentor and writing it down and editing it to make it well put together and so on. So this I'm going to read this from the Message. We've used this a couple of times before. It's a modern paraphrase. The editor, Eugene Peterson, went back to the original Greek and the original Hebrew, the Hebrew of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New Testament, but rather than translating it kind of literally, he decided he wanted to try to translate and paraphrase it in such a way that the meaning of the stories comes through rather than necessary specific words or just as an example, like salvation, that's such a loaded word, and he would try to work around that, because in our culture we don't really have a kind of an ongoing concept of salvation. Do you understand? We don't have experience of it. We don't, other than we understand ourselves to be saved and that to be salvation. But in our daily lives, we don't go into a store and come out feeling like somehow we've experienced salvation, or it's not part of our everyday life. What I want to read to you is from John, and it's again from the Message. The Word was first. The Word, and the word is capitalized. The Word was first. The Word present to God. God present to the Word. The Word was God, in readiness for God from day one. Everything was created through him. Nothing, not one thing, came into being without him. What came into existence was life, and the life was light to live by. The life light blazed out of the darkness. The darkness couldn't put it out. Then skipping a few verses that talks about John the Baptist. Oh, I'm actually going to go back to that. There once was a man, his name was John, sent by God to point the way to the life light. He came to show everyone where to look, who to believe in. John himself was not the light. He was there to show the way to the light. The life light was the real thing. Every person entering life, he brings into light. He was in the world, and the world was there through him, and yet the world didn't even notice. He came to his own people, but they didn't want him. But whoever did want him, who believed he was who he claimed, and would do what he said, he made to be their true selves, their child of God selves. These are the God begotten, not blood begotten, not flesh begotten, not sex begotten. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into our neighborhood. We saw the glory in our own with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. What do you think?
Sounds right.
You're familiar with what we usually read from in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and so on. This again just kind of cuts through some of the wordiness, I guess I might say, of the full translation, and gets to the point. Any comments? Any questions?
All been very good.
Well, if you're going to compare it or go to the, what was I going to say? The reading for the institution of the Eucharist,
Yes.
then you have right there, the Word became flesh.
Yes.
So there it is.
Yeah. And that's that's exactly what our Lutheran understanding is. This again, that this incredible concept that God has become human, enfleshed, and that somehow, in some bizarre way, we are able to eat that flesh and drink that blood, and not think of it as a metaphor. Quite a few Christians do believe that it's a kind of a representation. This bread reminds us of the body of Jesus, and the blood reminds us of, calls to mind for us. We Lutherans and Roman Catholics and Episcopalians, we and a few others, we have always insisted that this
Yes.
this bread and wine doesn't represent, but is the incarnated, enfleshed body and blood of God. Does that make sense? And is that clear to you?
That's what we've been taught.
Always clear to me.
And we have never understood how.
Never will.
We don't need to understand. We're just told it and taught, and too bad you can't see my hands. It's what we have understood and had in our brain our whole life, if we've been in the church.
Right. And does it make sense to us because it's been ingrained in us? And I actually use the word "does it make sense" pretty loosely, because it doesn't make sense to me.
Do we believe in it?
Right.
Right.
Just because it doesn't make sense doesn't mean you can't believe.
True.
A lot of things that don't make sense.
Any other comments or questions? So where do we get the stories of the Lord's Supper? We noticed in the comparison of the Gospels back in I guess I was in Lent, that it already shows up in Mark's Gospel, the first of the Gospels. Luke and Matthew both continue. They expand the narrative a little bit more of the backstory, excuse me, in each one, and a little bit more drama around Judas in kind of the expanded versions of the story. Do you remember where it is in John's Gospel?
No,
Not me. No.
I'm looking.
John's Gospel is different from the others. We've said that a lot of times. The other three are called the Synoptic Gospels because they have a synopsis. They have essentially the same timeline. John has a different timeline. In John's Gospel, it appears that Jesus goes from Galilee to Jerusalem, back to Galilee, back to Jerusalem, couple times a year for a few years, maybe 3 years. So the kind of the time frame is different. We pointed out in our comparative study last time, in the Synoptic Gospels, the Last Supper with the disciples is a Passover meal. And in John's telling of the story, the day of preparation for Passover, that is the day that the Passover lamb would have been slaughtered, was the day that Jesus was crucified. So John is trying to make a very close connection between the sacrifice of the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world, and that Passover lamb that harkens back to the coming out of Israel. And I assume that that you remember that story, and we will go back to it. But the story of the blood of the lamb saving the Hebrew people. The other thing that is that's different in John's gospel is that at his Last Supper with his disciples, he doesn't give them the bread and the wine. At his Last Supper with the disciples, he gets down on his hands and knees and washes their feet and gives them a new commandment, that from now on you should love one another as I have shown you the way. This new commandment. In much of Western Christianity, that's from the Roman Catholic Church and then into the liturgical Protestant churches, Maundy Thursday. Maundy is the same as it comes from mandate, and it means command. And on Maundy Thursday, we celebrate the two new commands that we get from Jesus. From John's gospel, we get the love one another, wash the feet of one another. I make this a command to you for all time. In the synoptic gospels, there's the command, do this in remembrance of me. Jesus has started something and given us a command, a mandate, that we should continue that for all time. And when we do that, he will be there with us. It's a command that comes with a promise. I'll stop there for a second, see if you have questions.
I don't have a question, but another observation I have is I think that in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he has the best explanation of the Eucharist, of the institution at the Last Supper.
And remember what chapter that's in? I was just checking.
I'm in 11.
11, thank you. I was in 15 and I thought that's where it was. But yeah, that's a very very good point, especially keeping in mind that Paul is the earliest Christian writer that we have. So the fact that Luke and Matthew have language that's similar to Paul's language tells me that either Paul's language was adopted kind of universally, or that already by the time Paul is writing, this is the oral tradition that he is now putting into writing. Can you read the part that you're talking about, Martha?
Yes, let's see. I'm gonna start at verse 20 in chapter 11. When you meet in one place then, see, and I think he's writing because he knew they were already meeting to do this.
Right.
When you meet in one place then, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in eating, each one goes ahead with his own supper, and one goes hungry while another gets drunk. But do you not have the houses in which you can eat and drink? I should go further than that. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you. So he's getting this directly from Jesus, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was handed over, took bread, and after he had given thanks, broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, also the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until the Lord comes." And then he
Okay,
goes,
thanks. You can stop there.
yeah,
Yeah, that's really helpful. The couple of things there to keep in mind. One is that this starts out by an admonishment on Paul's part that they are, instead of having this agape meal where everybody, it's a big potluck. Everybody brings what they can, and if you can't bring anything, you bring yourself, and that's good enough. It's a communal meal, and instead of that kind of celebration, what they're doing is essentially they're having the first class people over here having lobster and steak. Well, not lobster, but and then over here are the people who
Hot dog.
have their things that they went to the fast food place, and then the people who just bring
nothing.
a fish and a loaf of bread, and Paul says that's not the agape feast. And then he makes a big transition to what he say he is passing on what was passed on to him. Remember that Paul was, before he was the Apostle Paul, he was a pain in the pin feathers, pain in the pin feathers, Paul, for Saul, persecuting the Christians. So for several years after the resurrection of Jesus, at the very beginning of the growth of the Christian church, Paul was a persecutor. He was not likely to have been going to Sunday school and catechism classes to be learning about Christianity. If he was going to those at all, it was to arrest Christians and take them to the Jewish authorities. It was his complete conversion experience on the road to Damascus that changed him from Saul to Paul, given a new name by God. He says, by Jesus himself, he says he saw Jesus. He saw the resurrected Jesus, not just a vision. He talks about, when he's talking about the resurrection, he says Jesus was alive. He appeared, first to the two women, and then to all the disciples, then to this group, and then to that group, and lastly, and by this there's a gap of years, lastly he appeared to me, to Paul. But again, Paul is the earliest of the Christian writers, so we're very indebted to him for understanding, getting us as close to primitive Christianity as we're able to get. Even Luke, who writes the book of Acts, which tells about the very first years of the Christian church, even Luke is a generation after Paul. So there's I'm sorry, there's a gnat in here. I'm not gesturing so wildly except to try to get rid of this gnat.
I hate
So again, we go to Paul as really a primary source for the earliest understanding of Christianity. Another point that's helpful to make, I think, is that the Greek word that is that we translate do this in remembrance of me. In the original Greek, it didn't in the version of Greek that the New Testament was written in, that the term, and it's Anastasius, I think, and it doesn't mean just having a memory of. It is it's a term that that kind of carries within it a dramatic reenacting and kind of suspending normal time and going into sacred time, sacred space, and being in that time and place, Anastasius, with Jesus. Again, it's not just, oh yeah, I remember that Jesus is the guy who died on the cross and was raised on the third day. It is that I have an experience of communion with this man who died and was raised from the dead, and who, stretching that back into the incarnation, is in fact the Son of God. And as I said, some Christian traditions have adopted the understanding that the communion is kind of an important gesture, like we pledge allegiance to the flag, but that's not what makes us American, is that we pledge allegiance to the flag. This kind of participation in the remembrance of brings us into that reality. That's why we call it communion. It's communion with Jesus himself. It's also communion with all of those others around the communion table, around the world, who are communing. It's also communion with all the saints of all the times and all the places who have their place already now at the heavenly banquet. They're just waiting for us to join them. But meanwhile, we share this common meal. They on the other side of time, we still in time, but for a moment, we want to experience the timelessness of being in communion with God. Any comments? Any more questions or comments on the Lord's Supper, on incarnation, on the connection between the two?
It's been very enlightening.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
Well, these things get a little mixed up over the years.
And
Every once
I
in a
always
while, they need to be straightened out.
I always think it's dangerous to put a Bible in somebody's hands and say, here, make learn from this or whatever. I just think and it's obviously in my vested interest as a teacher in the church to say people need guides to understand the Bible,
Right.
because it's not self-explanatory.
It's not an easy read.
It really isn't.
Oh.
And it it makes you come face to face with some really challenging understandings
Right.
that are sometimes troubling. For instance, some of the in the Old Testament, some of the portrayal of the of an angry God,
Mhm.
or things like the wonderful story of the 10 plagues, and Pharaoh changes his mind all the time. Well, it's in the story, it's God hardens his heart. Well, that's not fair. Let Pharaoh decide for himself. I mean, for the purpose of the story, it's great, because now, Pharaoh says yes, and then he says no. Then there's another plague, and he says, okay, yes, you can go. And then he says, oh, wait, no, I want you to stay. And there's, that goes on and on.
And even after they leave, he goes after them.
Right. Another huge set, and we're going to get to this next week. Next week, we're going to be looking at the call of Abraham and Sarah.
Oh, that's good.
And we've got a couple of minutes now. I'm just going to give you a quick preview, and we've talked about this in several different contexts. But the understanding that this call to Abraham and Sarah was a unilateral call on God's part to them, that also conveyed a promise from God to them and elicited from them a faithful response. They heard the call from God. They heard the promises made by God to them, and they responded by leaving their home and traveling to a land that God promised to show them to take them to. And it was their response in faith that that begins the story of Israel and Christianity, because we understand that story to be the predecessor, if you will, for our story. So when we get to it, we've talked about this before, the threefold promise to Abraham and Sarah, that I will make of you a great nation. I will give you a land of your own, and through you, I will bless all the people of the world. That second piece, I will give you a land, is as pertinent as today's headlines. The whole, I mean, when you read about the Israelites leaving Israel and going to the promised land, they have to go through Gaza. This is like 2,000, 3,000, almost 4,000 years ago. And we all know what's going on in Gaza and with Israel right now. Much of the fight is about the Zionist understanding that God intends for all time for that to be the homeland of the Jewish people. And it's pretty hard to kind of tease out other understandings of this promise that God made. But we'll get into it much more next week, and I hope maybe throw some light on current events as well. Any closing comments or questions? Thanks. Thanks everybody for
Thank you.
participating, and I will look forward to seeing you on Sunday and then again next Wednesday.
Thank you.
All right.
Have a
Good
good
night.
evening.
Good night.
Good night.